Heritage Trail. All right, first, the jury is
Yes, with the choir member, his wife, her brothers knew about it, they colluded, the couple ends up being killed. It was not a secret who had done this, and it became known as the trial of the century 4 years after the murder. The brothers were brought to trial in New Brunswick, and they were acquitted by the jury trial. And New Brunswick became known as the place where you can get away with murder. So Rich is here to tell us all about how this whole thing came about and how it got its reputation.
There we go. Folks, I'm just going to take a moment. We won't play through the whole song, but Reverend Edward Wheeler Hall and his lover, Eleanor Mills, used to go out in his car, go on picnics, go on road trips throughout central New Jersey, and they would often stop, lay down a blanket, and they had their portable Victrola, and this was their favorite song.
How did you power a portable Victrola?
Thank you. I was
Did
gonna
you
ask.
wind it?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. So obviously it's not our style of music, but in 1922, this was the style of music. This was pop music in 1922, okay? So now you know why, the big band jazz sound came really more popular 20 years later. But I'll just take a moment and load up the PowerPoint presentation. And what really interested me is being a native of East Brunswick. My dad taught at Rutgers all of his life, for his professional career. And having gone to Rutgers, I knew of the Hall Mills murder case, and of course William Kunstler's book back in the mid-1960s. And that perhaps was the leading book on the case for many, many years. And there have been other books over the years. But the Hall Mills murder remains to this day one of the most fascinating unsolved murders in all of American history. At its time, the number of print inches in newspapers far exceeded the Lindbergh baby kidnapping that happened 10 years later. In fact, people in New Brunswick were angry about the Lindbergh baby kidnapping because it knocked the Hall Mills case off the front pages or out of people's memories. So Death in Lover's Lane, the Hall Mills murder, 1922, the perfect crime. So, the crime, on Saturday in September, 2 bodies were found under a crabapple tree. Now, the whole case from the start was really very badly handled by the police and the investigators. For example, they never secured the crime scene. They never took photographs of the bodies. People wandering around the crime scene were picking up evidence, sometimes turning it into the authorities, sometimes not turning it into the authorities. So, for any type of forensic reconstruction of the crime scene, they couldn't. And even back then, they knew that they had messed up. And one of the reasons that they had messed up was, even though both residents were from New Brunswick, the murders occurred in Somerset County. And Abraham Beekman, the prosecutor for Somerset County, was not really interested in indicting or investigating murderers who may be amongst the most influential members of the New Brunswick community, i.e. Mrs. Edward Wheeler Hall, the Reverend's wife, or her well-known extended family, which include the Stevens family, the Carpenter family, and so forth. But it was front page news, the Daily Home News, Episcopal rector shot to death with woman in lonely place near the city. Now what's interesting about this is, on next to his body, somebody had propped up his calling card next to his shoe, Reverend Edward Wheeler Hall. But there was no identification of the female. But as soon as the bodies were found, people in New Brunswick said, "Oh, it's Eleanor. It's Eleanor." People knew that they were having an affair. Mrs. Hall knew that they were having an affair. And I'll get to that in just a moment. But it was front page news. It was picked up by wire services all across the United States. And for weeks, it remained front page. Now, the actual murderers themselves, Reverend Hall received a shot in this direction, meaning that he was down on the ground, most likely. Eleanor received 3 shots. 3 shots. What had happened was, and there were witnesses, sound witnesses, not eyewitnesses. There were people in the vicinity who heard the crime being committed. So, bang, woman screams, ah, woman screams, bang, bang, bang. And that's what happened. He got shot in the head, she screams, she starts to run away, bang, 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 3 bullets in the head, she's dead. Oh, and by the way, she's nearly decapitated.
Oh my God.
Only 3 inches of skin held her head to her neck. She was nearly decapitated. Okay? So if this was a crime of somebody who was robbing them or whatever, no. Everybody knew from the beginning it was a crime of passion. So, Lover's Lane off of DeRussy Lane, which is now present-day Franklin Boulevard. This is now a housing development across from the Parker Nursing Home on Easton Avenue. So this is now, of course, a housing development. It is New Jersey, after all. And this is an aerial photograph of the vicinity. So, just to orient ourselves, St. Peter's Hospital would be right over here. The vocational school's right here, Bucalo Park. This was the property, the Phillips Farm property. Even at the time, it was starting to be cleared for subdivision. Now, those houses weren't built. This photograph is from 1926, from one of the New York daily newspapers. But we have the Phillips Farm house, which was abandoned, but still fully furnished. And it was a local hangout. If you wanted to play cards, you wanted to have a tryst, if you wanted to have a booze party, people would go in there, and it was a well-known local party house. Lover's Lane was a well-known Lover's Lane. And Eleanor and the minister were not the only ones to use Lover's Lane, although there is some debate whether or not they actually used Lover's Lane, or whether or not they were forced there under duress and then executed. Now, it's interesting in Bucalo Park, right over here, you can't really see it in this photograph, but there's a path here, and at the end of that path was a bench, and that was the Lover's Bench. That's where they would meet regularly, on a bench along the wood line next to the Parker home. And of course, that's what it looks like today. You know, big difference. So, Bucalo Park over there on the left, DeRussy's Lane is Franklin Boulevard, and right over here, those are the 4 homes that you saw in the earlier picture. Right over here is where the bodies were found. And the people who live on that street regularly get, "Hey, did you know?" Now, the victims, star-crossed lovers. Edward Wheeler Hall was 41. That's a good picture of him. By the time he was in his 40s, he was not as relatively good-looking as that picture. He was a little bit stocky. He was balding. He was very muscular. He went out and worked out at the YMCA. In fact, one of his YMCA cards was in his wallet. But he was a ladies' man. He liked the ladies. In 2 of his previous parishes, his superiors had noted that he, spends a little bit too much time with the women of the congregation. And Eleanor Mills. Eleanor Mills was Eleanor Reinhardt. Her father was a German immigrant. They spoke German at home when she was a girl growing up. She was very ill. In the previous January, she had a kidney removed. She had had another operation. And she was a pretty frail person. She was a pretty frail person. But she was a soprano in the choir, and everybody knew that the two were having an affair. The victim espouses. That's Frances Noel Stevens Hall. On the left, she was 7 years older than her husband. And even when she was a young woman, she was not the most attractive person in the world, but she was a millionairess. So,
Pretty attractive.
in this picture, yes. 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 That's a rough 48. Yeah. And the real heroine of the story is this young 16-year-old girl, Charlotte Mills. She and her mom were very good, good friends. They were very close. Her mom became pregnant, married the father, and Charlotte was the baby. And she and Eleanor shared the attic bedroom together. Eleanor and her husband did not sleep together for quite a while leading up to the murder. Jim had been fired earlier on from a factory. The minister had gotten him a job as a sexton, janitor, at the church, St. John's the Evangelist. And he was also the custodian at the Lord Sterling School, which was right across the street from 49 Carmen Street in New Brunswick. By the way, those buildings are all still standing. But in any event, he claimed that he didn't know anything about the affair, but under questioning, he knew about the affair. And he didn't care. He didn't care.
What does that headline say on it?
That headline says, 3 mad murderers escape. I am ready, Mrs. Gibson. So Mrs. Gibson is the infamous pig woman. How many, do people know about the pig woman? No. Okay? Okay, well you will. Now, Eleanor was in the choir. She was a soprano. She was not the choir director, as a lot of people think she was the choir director. She was not. But, and that's a retouched photograph of Reverend Hall, by the way. That's a very heavily retouched photograph of Reverend Hall. You'll see a lot of these photographs were retouched for the newspapers. Some were cut and paste jobs. Some they misidentified people. But that's the choir. And in the 1926 testimony, Barbara Two, who was one of the maids in the Hall mansion, the Reverend's house, actually Mrs. Hall's house, she said that everybody in the choir knew about the affair. Everybody in the choir knew about the affair. So this is September 17th, no clue to murder of clergyman and choir leader. Okay, again, a heavily retouched photograph of the minister. Very heavily retouched. In fact, it's so funny, in 1926, when Charlotte was brought up to the witness stand, and they introduced pictures of the Reverend and her mom. Of course, with her mom, she said, yeah, that's my mom. She looked just like that. When she had been shown the picture of the Reverend, she said, well, it's not really his likeness.
Now, why did they do that? Like, why?
Why? Because, well, I mean, back in the day, they used to retouch photographs all the time. So what sells more paper? A good-looking guy, or a really not so good-looking guy? So the wife of slain rector tells newspaper men she had no hatred, and she was not jealous of Mrs. Mills. She denied, see, that's a closer picture of what he looked like. She denied any knowledge of the affair. Yet at the time in 1922, her best friends said, oh, they used to joke about it. So, it's the wall of silence. If you don't admit to anything, they can't prove anything. Freeholders offered a $1,000 reward, leading to capture Hall's Mill murder. It's still September 1922. But let's see, at some point, okay. Daughter of slain singer determined to solve the murder. So like 2 weeks go by, nothing is happening. Beekman, who's in charge, nothing is happening. No arrest, no real investigation. And Charlotte writes a letter to the governor. She said, Governor, you have to step in and do something. So the governor appoints a special investigator named Mott from another county, from I think Essex County, and Mott begins an investigation. The state police are brought in, and it's really very, very fascinating because all of this is played out daily in the newspapers. Where couple was last seen, there were 3 witnesses who saw Eleanor, and then about 15 minutes later, Reverend Hall. Here's the vocational school. St. Pete's is right here. And they walked along the edge of the park, and they were going to their lover's bench, which was on the other side of the Bucalo Park near the Parker Nursing Home. Mott confident as he prepares for grand jury probe. Okay? So in November 1922, 2 full months after the murder, Mott believes he solved the case. His star witness is a woman named Mrs. Gibson. It's not really her real name. Her real name is Mrs. Easton. But because the land she lived on had been owned by a Gibson family, she went by the name of Gibson. So, she swears to Mott that she witnessed the whole thing. She witnessed the whole thing. I'll just say very quickly. So, Mrs. Gibson has a farm over basically where the New Brunswick High School is now located. That's pretty far from the murder site. Pretty far. She says, you know, my mule Jenny, I had heard some people trying to rustle some of my food, and I went on my mule Jenny to try to track down the rustlers, and I went down, and I heard noises, I heard an argument. I was only like from here to where Brian is standing. I was behind a bush. I saw the whole thing. And Mott believed her. Mott believed her. Big mistake. So that's the pig lady. Mrs. Gibson is the pig lady. Okay. So, December 5th, Attorney General declares status of case unchanged by action of grand jury. The grand jury sitting in Somerville refused to bring any indictments. Mrs. Gibson had said she saw Mrs. Hall, Frances Noel Stevens Hall. She saw Willie Stevens, who was a special needs person. She saw a man named Henry Stevens, who was Frances's brother. Problem was, Henry Stevens lived in Lavallette, New Jersey. He was in Lavallette, New Jersey, the night of the murders. So the Mott put all his cards in this one basket, and the basket broke. So, 1922, case is over. The lovers. So, here's a Halloween photograph. This is of a much larger one. There's the minister, and who is right at his knees? Charlotte. I'll let you ponder all of the implications of that. Let me just tell you that the love letters that they sent back and forth to each other would make 50 Shades of Grey pale in comparison. It's for real, for real. So star-crossed lovers, they exchanged letters. They went on trips to New York City, including to plays and movies. They went on church social outings, obviously, and they had a weekly rendezvous at our road. Now, the thing about the church social outings is, of course, there were other people there, but they always found ways to kind of be together. Oh, in one instance, they were showing a movie at the church. You know, they had movies back then. They were showing a movie at the church in the social hall, and the whole room was dark, but in the old movie projectors, there'd be that little lamp that, projected the image on the film. Well, by the light of that lamp, Eleanor's sister saw Eleanor and the minister holding hands in the middle of the church, in the middle of a movie social function. Slain Rector's love throbs in verse. So in 1926, they had a prosecutor read all of the love letters. When the bodies were found, there were about 12 or so love letters from Mrs. Mills to the Reverend found on and next to the bodies. His letters to her were found in her home, and the family sold them to a newspaper for money because they were poor. But in any event, it's interesting. All of their love letters before September 1922, there's no copy of them. If you read carefully the details, they had a habit of burning their love letters. If you burn your love letters, there's no trace for anybody to accidentally find them. So that's why we have no love letters before September 1922, except there's a lover's diary from August of that year that we'll talk about in a minute. But okay, so Dr. Hall in July, early August 1922, just like 3 weeks before they're murdered, Dr. Hall writes to Eleanor, "I can't talk to you anymore in the presence of Mrs. Hall or Jim. Don't be surprised in any way when you were talking to them. Something gets all out of order, and then I lose my peace and self-possession. Dearest, love me hard, harder than ever, for your babykins is longing for his mother." Life is infinitely sweet. Crush me, and pour my burning kisses on your dear body. And to look deep into those wonder eyes of love and just drink of the most wonderful thing in life, our love, wholly, completely yours. Dear heart, storing up health and strength to be your gypsy king, strong in that love which is strength and calm and peace in those granite hills and the depth, wonder, mystery of these refreshing, glittering seas about me. That's when he's up in Maine. In one of his letters, he goes, "I want to fill you with my burning love." My burning love.
That's where Elvis got it.
So Eleanor had confided in her sisters. She had 2 close sisters, and she had confided in them. And it's funny, on Facebook, there's a Facebook page, Hall Mills Murder Case, and the granddaughter of one of these sisters is now a member of the group. She's from Patterson, New Jersey. So the rector and the woman took the photograph. So as I said, they would go on these long drives, they'd put out a blanket, and they would have a picnic lunch, and they'd have the little Victrola, and they would listen to music, like we would listen to music now. 40, 30 years ago, it was a little CD Sony Walkman, and whatever they have nowadays. But on one of their automobile trips together, Eleanor told me, they passed a garden in which some beautiful sweet peas were growing. Eleanor explained that they were her favorite flower. The pastor stopped the car. First he said, "I think I will get out and ask them if they will let me have some." But then he jumped out suddenly crying, "No, I won't do that. Watch." He went over to the wire fence, put his hand through it, and plucked a single flower. Returning to the car and presenting the bloom to Eleanor with a courtly manner, which she often described with great fondness, he said, "Eleanor, I have become a thief for your sake." Yeah, I mean, really pretty swarmy stuff. But you have to remember, Eleanor is this youngish woman in a loveless marriage. She has a great intellect, a great ambition to improve herself, and here's this man, college educated, a well-respected minister, man of cloth, of the upper society. Brian?
Is there any history of him doing this same kind of thing to other women?
Only gossip and rumor.
Okay.
Only gossip and rumor.
Okay.
Yeah. So in July of 22, the Women's Guild went down to the Jersey Shore. They had a place down there for the week. And Reverend Hall went down there to supervise the women. Mrs. Hall remained home. But the woman circled in the red is Minnie Clark. Minnie Clark, according to Eleanor, was also vying for the affection of the minister. And Eleanor viewed Minnie as a rival. And in one of the cases, Mrs. Hall came down to help drive people back. Because she drove, Mrs. Hall drove, Frances Noel Stevens Hall drove. She went down to help drive people back. So, the minister has his car, Mrs. Hall is down with her car, and they were talking about, okay, well, we'll drive together, and another person will take my car home. And the minister, no, you drive your car, Eleanor, jump in the front seat. Mrs. Hall was not a happy camper. She was not a happy camper. Okay? So again, this is the Phillips farm. That's the Phillips farmhouse, which within a few years was demolished to make way for a housing subdivision. And as soon as in December 22, no indictments, in early January, Frances Noel Stevens Hall goes away for 2 years on a cruise to Italy with her most intimate friend, Sally Peters. Sally Peters was a member of a lesbian colony up at Cragsmore, New York. I'm not saying Mrs. Hall was lesbian. I have no idea. I will just say that her best, most intimate friend, words of that generation that were from the newspapers, that they were extraordinarily close. So, now, she closes down her house. By the way, her house is now the home of the dean at Douglas College, over on Nickel Avenue, okay? The home of the dean is the house. In 1926, the exterior was remodeled. It had a wood exterior in 22. In 1926, they did the exterior into brick. But that's the house that Mrs. Hall and the Reverend lived in. So, she closes down the house for a couple of years, but there are 3 employees who remain on staff. Included in the list of those who have been told to look for new positions is Barbara Tu, and Miss Louise Geis, who was 18 at the time, Peter Tumulty, who has been in the employ of Halls for several years, Tumulty, employed by the Halls for several years, key, will guard the homestead during the absence of the family. It was he and his older teenage son, Peter Francis Tumulty. How many people have been to Tumulty's in New Brunswick? Okay, the son opened that in the 1930s, okay? He was a teenager at this time. He was involved in heisting liquor, robbing stores. He was arrested several times and his dad bailed him out. Peter Tumulty bailed him out. So, just saying. You'll see Mr. Tumulty's name come up again. Part 4, new investigation and trial. So, the years roll by. Louise Geis was 18 at the time of the murder. Again, her parents were German immigrants. And she had married during that time. And the man she married said, when he wanted a divorce from Louise Geis, for whatever reason, he made a statement to the state, grounds for which you're being divorced. You seek a divorce. He said, well, my wife told me that when she was intoxicated, she was involved with the murder of Reverend Hall and Eleanor Mills. And she went on to say that, according to the direct charges made by Real, Louise's husband, his wife had illicit relations with the slain clergyman. That Mrs. Real, Mrs. Frances Stevens Hall, the victim, the brother, Willie Stevens, and Peter Tumulty, the family chauffeur, motored on the night of the crime to the Phillips farm where the murders were committed. Okay? So that is the basis upon which, in 1926, a new investigation is undertaken, which leads to a trial. Okay? So, the trial was really big news. That's further testimony of Real, which basically says the same thing about how his wife told him when she was drunk about the real deal. And the trial was so big over in Somerville that this is Doris Duke and her mom. The trial was attended by thousands over the course of its time. Thousands. It was a huge event. We think of the Scopes Monkey trial in Tennessee, Inherit the Wind, the movie. Same thing. It was the same thing here. It was a carnival. And it was just crazy. People who owned the Phillips farm, they were charging admission for people to come and see the murder site. Come see where they were murdered. Come see where they were murdered. Yeah, it was really crazy. So by this time, the pig woman had developed a life-threatening illness, although she lived for like another 8 or 10 years. But she was on her deathbed. She was on her deathbed. Very hard to bring her into the courtroom. You can see how jam-packed the court was. They literally were shoulder to shoulder in this courtroom because you had the defendants now were Mrs. Hall, the minister's wife, her brother Willie, and her brother Henry. They were indicted. Peter Tumulty was not indicted. And they were just really jam-packed in there. And Mrs. Hall, being the millionaires, had a $1 million defense team. She had the best attorneys possible. So here they're taking testimony of Mrs. Gibson, aka the pig woman. Now, the pig woman had, every time she told the story, it was something a little bit new, something a little bit more elaborate. And her mother, Mrs. Gibson's mom, sat in the front row, go, liar, liar, liar. So it was really quite the show. The matter of the Dodge sedan. So the Halls owned 2 cars. They had a Case touring car and they had a Dodge sedan. Mrs. Hall could drive the Dodge sedan. She drove it all the time. And at the time of the murder, a rural mail carrier was making his way down Easton Avenue. And as he was driving down Easton Avenue, just very close to the murder scene, he saw an empty black Dodge sedan pulled to the side of the road. Okay? Dodge sedan. Peter Tumulty, this is his 26th testimony. Peter Tumulty, former Hall gardener chauffeur, had his little say, he proved to be the most hostile witness of the day. At present, he works for Mrs. Henry Carpenter, whose husband, Mrs. Hall's husband, is in Somerset County Jail awaiting trial on a charge. Tumulty couldn't remember washing the Dodge sedan on either Friday or Saturday after the murders. He couldn't remember seeing the car Friday or Saturday after the murders. He couldn't remember seeing the car Friday at all. It may have been in the garage. All day he was working over the celery plants in a remote corner of the Hall property. I encourage you to go see this house at Nickel Avenue. There's no remote corner. There's no remote corner. It's like saying I can't see Dunkin' Donuts if there was no wall. I can't see Dunkin' Donuts. Anyway, so he swears that he never washed the Dodge sedan. In 1970, which we'll get to in a little bit, in 1970, that testimony is contradicted. This is a Dodge sedan. Pretty cool looking car. And so Tumulty in August, okay. Question, were you ever employed at the Hall home? Yes, I went to the Hall home 4 or 5 weeks before the murder. What? No, he'd been working for them for years. Lie number 1. Did you wash the Dodge car? No. We'll challenge that in a little bit. And on August 18th, again, he says, the witness said that while he had washed the case machine, he had not washed the Dodge. Nor, he added, did he see anybody else wash it. Okay? No, we didn't touch the car. We all know that Brunswick shale, the good red clay shale in New Brunswick. Phillips Farm is loaded with it. If you walked over there without any pavement, like it was back then, your boots, your shoes, your clothing, your cuffs, your car would be filled with that red clay mud. Hall on trip with wife, made love, date. So again, at November 13th, 1926, an assistant prosecutor is standing there reading all of these torrid love letters. The prosecutor was very uncomfortable. This is 1922. We simply didn't talk about that stuff at all. So Mrs. Hall is sitting there with Willie. This is Willie. And she's just sitting there, just like totally unfazed by what's happening. And again, through all of this, she keeps saying, I didn't know anything. I thought they were just friends. I didn't know anything about this. Well, what about this? Or what about, I had no idea. So, As the last one was worded, dear, dear, tender, wonder heart of mine, have you felt as exalted mood as I am in today? Dearest, I have so longed to talk with you while holding you in my arms. I am not wild or fierce today, but peaceful and calm, strong and exalted. Such an assurance, I feel like Tennyson's strong son of God, immortal love. Dearie, dear heart, I want to hold you close, commune with you, hold you tight with my left arm, and stroke your dear, firm face and body with my right, and look deep down into those wonder eyes, hazel eyes. Dearest, you are like a crystal to me. I will call them crystal eyes. I seem to see and feel all that awe and wonder of the universe in them. And am I full of awe and wonder today? Now, if you're a very poor woman in her social situation, and this man of the world is giving you all these lines, you might swoon. You might swoon and accept it. Okay? Yeah. So he's up in with Mrs. Hall for 3 weeks up in Maine. They go up there every year, and he would sneak away to the Seal Harbor post office, where they would exchange the love letters. And Mrs. Hall said, she said, let's see. So Mrs. Hall is asking if any mail from Eleanor has come, but she didn't ask to see it. She just said, is there any news from Eleanor? As for writing to her, do just as seems best to you. It will be all right either way. So Mrs. Hall is saying, have you heard from Eleanor? And 1926, November, Mrs. Hall, Nerves of Steel, choristers, a gypsy queen. More and still more, the red, red rose letter, the gypsy queen letter, the baby kid letter, like grim ghosts trailing past Mrs. Hall and the jury, invisible ghosts, revealed in their presence only by the medium of sound as the prosecutor read on. Only a woman with nerves of steel could have withstood this ordeal, could have listened without a tear, if, as Mrs. Hall has told the world, she rated her husband's love the most beautiful thing in life. And of course, never underestimate the power of an extremely pissed off woman. And of course, Congreve's quote, heaven has no rage like love to hate return, nor hell of fury like a woman scorned. Not guilty, not guilty. Jury comes back pretty quick, not guilty. They did not believe Mrs. Gibson. The prosecution put all of their eggs in one basket. Mrs. Gibson, they didn't investigate Tumulty. They didn't investigate Louise Geis. They didn't investigate anybody else except Mrs. Hall and her brothers. And the jury just did not find Mrs. Gibson credible. So in that case, not guilty. Now, the men had been in jail. Who comes to take all the stuff out of the man and in his little dapper uniform? Peter Tumulty. There's good old Peter Tumulty. Now, at the time of the murder, Peter Tumulty is 45 years old. Irish immigrant. Anyway, he was pretty much of a roustabout. So Peter Tumulty, interesting guy. He was a chauffeur and a gardener. So here we go, Peter. He was born in Ireland in 1877. He's in New Brunswick in the 1890s, operating a restaurant out of his house on Throop Avenue. In New Brunswick, did they say Troop or Throop? Troop. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
I thought so. So there's Peter, okay? So on August 18th, 26, before the trial, now this is the pre-trial interviews. Peter Tumulty was called a man of about 50, whatever, wearing a brown suit, somewhat too large for him, entirely bald, blue-eyed, tight-lipped, who never said more than was required, but capable of saying that. His clear blue eyes contrasted in fresh sort of way with his weather-beaten face. So, missing garden shears. You can do a lot of damage to a neck with garden shears. 1926, examination by Peter Tumulty by Simpson, of Tumulty by Simpson. I might say to your honor, but there's a note among the late Beekman's papers saying, look for a missing pair of garden shears. And so to protect the state, because that note was found in the handwriting of the man, then in the case, I have injected this thing in the case, so that nobody will say that I have a note of Mr. Beekman's, which I have suppressed. So, in 22, garden shears are missing. September of 22, the garden shears are missing. Tumulty testifies on the stand that, oh no, I had the garden shears, but they broke in March of 23 and I threw them out. So in 22, they're missing. And at the trial, they said, no, they broke and I just threw them out in March of 1923. So in 22, they were looked for, they were missing. 4 years later, oh no, I threw them out 6 months after the crime. So anyway, the chauffeur tells of the shears, and again, I ask you just to think what kind of damage those could do to a person's neck. And by the way, if you look at the autopsy report, it describes it in different ways, but it's not like one cut this way. And by the way, how much force you have to exert to go through all of this soft tissue, break the vertebrae, okay? Knife ain't gonna do it. Talk about it. Slang. Items related to Peter Tumulty. Okay. So, Peter Tumulty, gardener chauffeur of the Hall home, explained to Senator Simpson that at present, the present home is purchased from proceeds of the sale of 2 small pieces of property. What had happened was, shortly after Mrs. Hall comes back, there's a corner lot where one of those Douglas College buildings is, right at the corner, I think Jones and Nickel Avenue. He buys a house from Frank Gamina for $1. How many people know the Gamina name? Okay. Right, Mr. Ron?
Yeah.
Okay. So Frank Gamina, father, at this time, let's just say Frank Gamina was known to be associated with some questionable activities. And he was a contractor back then. So Peter Tumulty buys a house for $1. There's no record in the deeds that he sells 2 pieces of property and turns around and buys it. There's no record of him selling the other properties, okay? He did have another piece on Troop, but that was a somewhat different matter. So, anyway, in 1924, this is the new house at 2 Sedan, so he buys the house in 24 from Frank Gamina. In 1924, Miss Tumulty, bride of Thomas Bogue, if I'm saying that right. So Miss Tumulty, Peter Tumulty's daughter, has a huge wedding reception. Huge wedding reception. Everybody's dressed to the nines, lots of food. Where's Peter Tumulty, the chauffeur / gardener, coming up with these thousands of dollars, in addition to the many thousands of dollars he spent bailing out his son? Just a question. Tumulty bride at pretty church wedding, okay, lavish wedding, 1924. 1927, 6 months after the acquittal, Mr. Tumulty's house at number 2 Sedan is bought by a state senator. A state senator, bigwig politician, buys this guy's house. It's a little weird, okay? It's a little weird.
Excuse me, where
Yeah.
is the Hotel Klein?
The Hotel Klein is where, what's that new, the Heldrich? The Heldrich.
Yeah,
That was the Hotel Klein. In its day, the Hotel Klein was the place.
so that must have been before it was the Roger Smith.
I think so. I think,
Yeah, it had
yeah.
to be. It had to be.
yeah. It's a little bit before my time.
You were-
So, 1970. Chris, you remember reading this in the paper about Detective Saloom and everything? Okay. 1970, a Hungarian guy who thinks he's dying, Julius Boliag, wants to clear his conscience. Again, another guy who goes on to live another 10 years. He's laying in St. Peter's Hospital overlooking Bucalo Park, and he had a pang of consciousness, not consciousness, conscience, pang of conscience. And he goes to the police, and he says, I know something about the Hall Mills murder case. So Boliag goes to New Brunswick. It opens up a whole new investigation by Detective George Saloom. In September 2013, I had the privilege and honor of talking with George Saloom in his home over near Church Lane in North Brunswick. He passed this last April at the age of 87. George told me everything that he did in this new investigation. In 1970, a lot of people are still around. You know, it was only 48 years after the murders, I guess, something like that. Anyway, so George Saloom does the investigation, and George Saloom interviews lots of people. Many of his notes are at Alexander Library. But here's what George told me. He believes that because of Reverend Hall's physical prowess, and he had been a wrestler in college, that he resisted. He resisted. And that's why somebody had a gun. Who brought a gun to this confrontation? Nobody knows. But he resisted, a gun went off, woman screams, she's a witness, we got to silence the witness, bam, 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 she's silenced. And remember the Dodge car? A family member of Peter Tumulty told Saloom, as Saloom related to me, that Peter Tumulty had indeed washed and detailed that Dodge car. Okay? So, I'm only going on what Detective Saloom told me back in 2013. So, for some reason, yes?
Just a quick question. Where does the cuts in the neck come in? There's bullets, but...
Oh, well, because she had been a choir singer, and if you're angry at somebody and they were a singer,
Gotcha.
cut your neck. Cut your throat, right? Now, the East Brunswick connection, Ike Gutman, Isidore Gutman. Ike Gutman is buried in the Jewish cemetery over off of Cranberry Road. Isidore Gutman was one of two men that Boliag implicated in playing a role in the murder. Boliag said that Willie Stevens had contacted Julius Boliag, who was young, obviously, back in 22, and wanted to know who can we get to take care of some business for the family. And ultimately, shortly after the murder, Mrs. Hall gave Julius Boliag 2 envelopes. Give one to a guy named Ike, give the other envelope to a guy named Fred. We don't know who Fred is, but Ike is Isidore Gutman. Okay? Isidore Gutman ran a speakeasy. He was a local, well-known criminal. And in 1934, I believe it is, I'll see in a moment, but over on Fern Road in East Brunswick, not too far from the Middlesex County Fairgrounds, a car full of petty racketeers was gunned down. 3 guys in this car were shot to death. Right across the street, on that street, is the old Stoltz home, now 2 houses, and there was a still activity, bootleg activity, during the Prohibition. So, Fern Road, there's Richie the Boot from Newark, and everybody believed, well, Richie owned that still over on Fern Road. Ike and his buddies were boosting alcohol, which they used to do back in Prohibition. They were, stealing alcohol, and they got caught. And they got murdered. They were murdered. So the 3 are suspected of having to try to bear down on a still in the vicinity of Dunham's Corner near New Brunswick, where the death car was found. They met their executioners who had been searching for them. They lay in the rear of the car, bound and lips taped, while the 17 bullets were pumped into them. Okay? Right here in East Brunswick, 1934. Who knew? Who knew? Who knew? A lot of bootlegging around here back in Prohibition. A lot of bootlegging. So Mr. Gamina, so in 24, Mr. Gamina sells the house to Peter Tumulty for $1 for other good and valuable consideration. I went to school with Mr. Gamina's grandson, also named Frank Gamina.
Was he in construction?
He was big time in construction.
My dad was an architect. I think he worked with.
Big time in construction. I'll let everybody put 2 and 2 together.
They had a bank too.
They sure did. Sure did. Put 2 and 2 and 2 together. And let's see. Oh, this just talks about Frank Amita and being in East Brunswick Township. Frank Amita built the original section of Lawrence Brook over by Tower Center. Those nice colonials overlooking the lake. That was Frank Amita's development. He built it. So I don't know how much more I have. Oh, just to recap. Well, there we go. Recap. So Peter Tumulty worked for the Hall family for years, not 4 or 5 weeks. Chauffeur and gardener, question mark fixer. 1922, garden shears are missing. Tumulty says they were broken and lost in 23. Shears are believed to be the weapon used in Mrs. Mills' near decapitation. There's a note in the 22 prosecution, we believe that some form of shears was the weapon used to chop off her head. Tumulty and son Frank are sole caretakers of the Hall mansion for 16 months. In February, Tumulty buys the house next to the Hall mansion, built and sold by Frank Amita. In 26, Tumulty identified as having driven Mrs. Hall and Willie. Tumulty testifies that he knew nothing of the Dodge sedan's whereabouts at the time. It was not washed or cleaned. And Tumulty is the right-hand man of the Hall family during this entire time. In 1970, a surviving Tumulty family member states to Detective Saloom that the car had both been washed and thoroughly cleaned in the interior. In 27, Tumulty buys a house at Sedan Street. A couple of years later, it's bought by Sullivan and Morrison, and the Tumulty establishment known as a speakeasy during Prohibition, and also a gambling operation in nearby Piscataway. I encourage you, there's newspapers.com, we actually get a week for free, but if you type in Tumulty and New Brunswick or the Home News, you'll come up with dozens of articles. So, I don't know who committed the murders. We'll never know who committed the murders. There's a whole Hungarian connection that I didn't even talk about. There's a big Hungarian connection. But it's generally well accepted that Mrs. Hall had her hand in it. It was a crime of passion. It was the crime, even at the time, described by a very jealous woman. And, you know, the whole thing, arranged marriage, a husband with a roving eye, etc., etc. It was just not a good combination. And finally, one of their favorite poems, I'm trying to remember the exact words specifically, but it goes something like, if the wages of sin be death, then I gladly accept it. And that was one of their favorite poems. So, that's what happened. So, any questions or comments? I'll be glad to entertain.
Did Tumulty have, was their pub where J&J World Headquarters was, and then they moved
Tumulty's?
it? Yeah.
Yeah, over by the railroad tracks.
Yeah, they moved it.
Yeah, they moved it, right, over by the railroad tracks, yeah.
It was on the other,
It was the
yeah,
red
the one
line
that was,
Right by
it's
the
just before you go
on
under the overpass.
George Street.
Oh, okay.
They were the only
Okay.
one, they held out when all that construction went
Yeah.
on. And that pub stayed there for 3 years until they moved.
When I gave this talk a couple of months ago at the EB Historical Society, a gentleman who was a lifelong New Brunswick resident and an older gentleman said, back in the day, we ran wires from the Nielsen Street area to Tumulty's to let them know when a raid was going to take place. Okay? She's a guys, the cops are on their way. Okay. All right? So.
I believe it was just recently sold in New Brunswick.
It was.
The Chumley family.
The family who owns the Brunswick Grove bought that. Yeah.
William Kunstler in the Minister and the Choir Singer seemed to hint that it could have been the KKK
Right.
because they didn't like extra heroin.
Right. No. At the time, the KKK said, if you think it was us, you're crazy. No, there's no any evidence or even reason to think it was the KKK. You know, somebody think it was the mafia. The mafia's not going to rub out an Episcopal minister. It's just not going to happen. You know. So, but the more we dig, the more questions there are. For a while, I thought Peter was involved. But then I'm like, I don't know. You know, maybe the Hungarians were involved. I don't know.
You always say follow the money. What happened with the money,
Oh.
or relatives?
Okay, so that's very interesting. Immediately after Reverend Hall's body is found, Mrs. Hall goes to the bank with a couple of her family members and her lawyer. They opened up his safe deposit box. In his safe deposit box was $41,000
Oh my
in
God.
bonds, Liberty bonds. Now, 11,000 could be explained. You know, the mother-in-law died, she left him a bequeath of 10 grand, but 30 additional $1,000 is found in that box. The two lovers had talked about running away to Japan. They had been reading books, The Mother of All Living and Simon Called Peter, which were like softcore porn back at the time. And they, in both books, running away to the Orient was like a plot line. And they were talking about running away to the Orient. And during his funeral, somebody was overheard to say, well, I guess I'm not going to make it to Japan after all. But where did this guy get $30,000 worth of Liberty bonds? He got them from somewhere. And I'm thinking he got them, you know, by dipping into his wife's accounts. You know? See, bonds, you can just keep bonds in a drawer. You know, you don't have to put them in the bonds. It was like holding a stock certificate. So I'm thinking, perhaps, he got these $30,000. In today's money, that's over $650,000 in today's money. That buys a lot of distance.
Wow.
So there was no DNA evidence?
No. If you said DNA back then, they'd go,
But
what?
I mean, they didn't think he was so messed up.
Well, okay, so, the only DNA you would have would be her blood, his blood. That's all you would have.
I know they didn't do that stuff back then, but there's a lot of, you have to go back.
Yeah, I mean, and the crime scene was so messed up,
Yeah.
right, that so that goes to the issue of the calling card. The calling card is propped up on his foot, and there are fingerprints on it. 3 experts say the fingerprints are those of Willie Smith. The problem is, they didn't have a chain of custody for the calling card. And based on the fact they didn't have a chain of custody for the calling card, it led to reasonable doubt. Okay? But 3 experts said that's Willie's fingerprint. Okay?
You had one headline there that said something about Park Police arresting R.W. Johnson.
Oh,
Was that connected?
no, that's a secondary story.
Yeah,
Yeah, I don't know about that one, but that's a secondary story, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And by the way, we think we live in troubled times, and there's so much violence. Today we pale in comparison with what was going on 100 years ago. Not that that's a good thing, either or, but you know, all this stuff that we read about and we think, well, we're the only one. No, this stuff has been going on forever. You know?
Was there anybody that was like accused, well, not accused, but did everybody say, well, it had to be them? Or it had to be, you know, somebody and...
The prosecutors, both Mott, who was brought in 22, and Simpson, who was brought in 26, they both zeroed in on Mrs. Hall based solely on the pig lady's testimony. All these other witnesses, all these other trails of evidence, they completely ignored because they thought they had, you know, eyewitness testimony. But the women made the whole thing up.
There's a great picture of the pig lady's house, I think in the history of Somerset County, and it's like this shack.
Yeah,
So it's
yeah,
really,
yeah.
And was she the big lady because
She raised pigs. Yeah, she raised pigs. Look, back then, I mean, we all come up with, well, President Trump is great for making up nicknames for people. Back then, the press made up nicknames. The pig lady, Adonis, this, that, the other. So,
I don't know if I'm having a senior moment though. It's Hall's wife is suspected of
yes,
being lesbian.
yeah. Well, okay. That's several people in addition to myself. That's the way we think.
Okay, so then, all right, but
Mhm.
surmise that she is.
Yeah,
And how's it a crime of passion?
maybe
because
She's the one
her
that's
whole,
rich.
but her whole world is built on this facade. Yeah, her whole world is built on this facade. And again, most people don't think they went out there to murder them. They went out to confront them. Hey, this crap has got to stop. Enough is enough. Because it really was spinning more and more and more. It was really getting out of hand. They had been, the lovers had been friends, acquaintances, and within the last year leading up to their death, every week it was getting hotter and hotter and hotter and harder to suppress.
So you thought they might have to stop them with garden shears in their hands?
Well, so if Peter Tumulty is the chauffeur gardener,
Or you kept it in the trunk?
well, he might have been in the back. I don't know. That's, and like I said, who would bring a gun? Who would bring a gun?
Right.
I don't know.
Sounds like
Who would bring a gun?
Sounds like a murder was planned almost.
Well, and some people think, well, you know, they were so obvious that it did point to Mrs. Hall, the Reverend's wife. It was so obvious that she couldn't have done it. So
What
that's
happened-
why we'll never know.
What happened to her later on?
Mrs. Hall? Okay, so she goes to Europe several times in the next 10 years. She establishes herself as the benefactress of Middlesex Hospital, now Robert Wood Johnson, of the church. Remember, she's worth millions of dollars. She's holding parties at her house. She's holding socials. She is become the matron of New Brunswick.
Where did her mom come from?
Okay, so part of her family is the Carpenter family, and they were part of the Janeway Wallpaper Company. They were part of the Stevens family. They had multiple sources of income. Multiple sources of income. Yeah. And when Mrs. Hall's mom died about a year and a half, oh, well, this is a cool point. So Mrs. Hall's mom dies about a year before the murders. Mrs. Hall is in mourning, et cetera, et cetera. She's got money. The woman seen at the murder site was described as a woman wearing a gray polo coat. Right after the murder, Mrs. Hall sends out a gray polo coat to Philadelphia to be dyed black. Why, they ask? Well, because it's for mourning. I'm like, well, wait a minute. She doesn't have any black clothes, and it's September. Why do you need a coat? A coat, you know. So a lot of things don't add up. Yeah. Why would you send a gray polo coat to get dyed black in Philadelphia? Your mom had just died a year earlier. You have no black clothing? Seriously?
Not only that, why didn't you just buy a new one?
Seriously, right.
And cover the stage.
Is that how still functioning?
Yes. But they do not like to talk about this. They do not like to talk about this at all. It's on George Street, very close to, I guess that's Commercial Avenue?
Yeah, it's off of the Rutgers Security Building.
Yeah,
It's on
right.
the corner, and this is right on George, right next to the
Yeah.
security building.
Right across from the new Lord Sterling
Yeah.
School. It's a cute little building. It's a very cute little building. Yeah. Any other questions? So let me ask you guys, who do you think did it? The butler in the library with the camera.
I think Mrs. Hall hired someone to do it.
Yes.
It doesn't sound like something she knew.
You know, there's a whole connection with the Hungarian community that Detective Salou investigated, and the people remembered what was going on.